McDonald.
Mr Speaker, the Transport Secretary has awarded a £14 million contract to a company with no money, no ships, no track record, no employees, no ports, one telephone line and no working website or sailing schedule. 2 of seaborne freight directors would not pass normal due diligence requirements. One of them, Ben Sharp, is already under investigation by a government department. Did the DfT consult other departments about Mr Sharp's fitness as a company director? Ben Sharp quit his business activities in the Gulf with a trail of debt behind him. His company, Mercator, was merely a shell, finding vessels for security companies. Is it right that he operated the licence he needed pursuant to the Export and Control Act 2008? Did he do it without that licence? Yes or no? It's abundantly clear from the promissory note published by Channel 4 News that Sharp owed and still owes Mid-Gulf over £1 million and many more companies besides. How is it that Deloitte, Slaughter and May, Mott McDonald were instructed to restrict their due diligence examination to the face value of the presentation put to them by Seaborne? Why on earth had they been allowed to restrict their investigation to the present company and not the trading history of the individuals concerned, and in particular Ben Sharp? The Mayor of Ostend has made it very clear that Seaborne cannot berth at his port, and they have no bank guarantees and no contract with Ostend. They are without capital. Who is investing in Seaborne? Who is paying for the dredging of Ramsgate? Mr Speaker, this is a shoddy and tawdry affair, and the Secretary of State is making a complete mess of it. This contract is very likely unlawful and violates every current best practice guidance issued by Whitehall. When will he realise that this country cannot continue to suffer the consequences of his gross incompetence? Why, Mr Speaker, is this calamitous Secretary of State still in post?
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm not even going to address the idiocy that the party opposite, the Honourable Gentleman, has just come up with. He has made a number of allegations which I suggest he goes and makes elsewhere. I'm simply going to say this. This government has let a contract for which we will pay no money until and unless ferries are running. That is responsible stewardship of public money. Other matters, there are no reasons in the due diligence we have done to believe that any of those involved in this business are not fit to do business with government. And I say this again, we are not spending money unless these ferries operate.
Mr Ryan Patterson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think many of us would agree that much the best end solution with the talks between the government and the EU would be a wide-ranging free trade agreement as offered by President Tusk in March with zero tariffs. But to bring the EU to the table and to counter the very arrogant boasting of Mr Selmayr in the Passo a Neue Presse, which many of us have been reading since we read about them yesterday, it's obvious that to show that we are deadly serious, we must prepare for world trade terms. And can I therefore commend the Secretary of State for the various actions he has taken to show that we are deadly serious about preparing this country to work under world trade terms with which we work with the rest of the world.
Grateful to my right honourable friend. It is absolutely right and proper that we prepare for all eventualities. The sad thing is to see the party opposite simply trying to destroy Brexit, taking a destructive approach to any sensible measures this government takes to prepare for all Brexit eventualities. Frankly, they're not fit to be in opposition, let alone a government.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. No boats, negative equity, £374,000, no history of running ferry or freight services. Current Director Brian Raincock and Ben Sharp, Chief Exec, both had companies liquidated owing HMRC money, with Raincock's debt at £600,000. Now, HMRC is us, the taxpayer. So what then constitutes due diligence and what red flags were identified? How did this company get handpicked for direct negotiation for operating out a port that's not even ready? Now, his written statement indicates direct negotiation is possible under Regulation 32, which relates to an emergency situation brought about by unforeseeable events, yet the government claimed to be planning for a no-deal for over 2 years. So what legal advice was provided? What level of madness exists to contract contingency planning to a company with no track record of that service? Now, saying they'll only get paid if they deliver misses the point if they don't actually deliver the so-called emergency contingency service. That leaves us high and dry. Is this the project the ministerial direction was required for? Is there central government instruction and process for awarding of these no-deal Brexit contracts? If so, can we see it? Does this contract comply with that guidance? And if so, that highlights the shambles of this government's no-deal preparations. And when will they do the right thing and go?
Mr Speaker, this procurement was done properly in a way that conforms with government rules, and it was done in a way that secures the position of the taxpayer by ensuring that no money will change hands unless and until the ferries are running. He doesn't seem to listen.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I join with my right honourable friend for North Shropshire for my right honourable friend's determination to be prepared for all eventualities? And he succeeded on aviation services, on the Transit Convention and other things that will ensure that trade keeps flowing. But what are the lessons to learn from this situation? However good this company may actually be, this is a very difficult contracting environment where things have to be done very quickly under extreme and intense, very political public scrutiny. Will my right honourable friend ask the Permanent Secretary to conduct a quick lessons learned exercise so that companies with which the government is contracting are prepared, better prepared than this company was, for the scale of public scrutiny it's been subjected to?
Well, my honourable friend makes a valid point about public scrutiny. This contract was properly passed through and signed off by my department's accounting officer, and it's been done in a way, I think, the best possible way for dealing with a new business that is starting out for the first time, which is to ensure they're only paid when they deliver the service. That, I think, is a responsible use of taxpayers' money.
Lillian Greenwood.
Mr Speaker, I've already written to the Secretary of State with a long list of questions about his department's procurement of additional ferry services as part of no-deal planning, and I look forward to receiving his response. But yesterday, Lloyd's Loading List reported some extraordinary remarks from the CEO of Seaborne Freight, Jean-Michel Copians, about the proposed Ramsgate to Ostend route, amongst which he said, "Then we've had to identify the vessels best suited to the type of crossing, which we're keeping a secret for the moment. With no crew, no signed contracts in place with Ramsgate or Ostend, no clear plans to bring the infrastructure back into service, and now secret ships, isn't there a huge question mark over the deliverability of this service?"
I'm confident and my officials are confident in the deliverability of this service, but if they don't succeed in delivering this, we don't pay.
Charlie Elphick.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that no-deal contingency planning is very much in the national interest, and would he join with me in condemning those people who want to try to stop us doing no-deal planning, using parliamentary wrecking tactics and sabotage and Trump-style government shutdown threats? Would he agree with me that that would make problems in Kent more likely? Those sorts of wrecking tactics from the Labour Party would make problems in Kent and elsewhere more likely, and it's irresponsible, reckless and wrong.
I completely agree with my honourable friend. It is right, and he will agree with me, right and proper, we do everything we can to keep trade flowing through the Port of Dover and through the Channel Tunnel as smoothly as possible. These are prudent measures to ease potential pressures on those ports. I think this is a sensible thing to do. The risk to the taxpayer is not there because we're not paying unless the service is delivered. The party opposite don't seem to believe in no-deal Brexit planning.
Hilary Benn.
Much indeed, Mr Speaker. I have to say the Secretary of State takes a rather unusual approach to contract letting, because as soon as he's questioned about the ability of the firm with whom he's contracted to actually deliver on what they have promised, he tells the House, well, if they don't do it, he won't pay. Now, he said a moment ago that he is confident that they will be able to run the service. So can he answer a very simple question? Has the company, Seaborne, told the department which vessel it has acquired in order to provide the service, which could be needed in just over 2 months' time?
So, Mr Speaker, the company has told my department in great detail about its plans, which are being finalised commercially, and we are confident that they will deliver the service.
Sir Nicholas Soame.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My right honourable friend will be aware that Seaborne have had in mind for well over 2 years now to start the Ostend to Ramsgate route. And will he agree with me that this sort of constant denigration of this contract, which after all means that the contractor will not get one single penny of anyone's money until it fulfills the contract, is damaging to sensible work? Finally, will he tell the House whether or not, if in extreme circumstances, and mentioned by my right honourable friend, that we were to crash out, God forbid, on world trade terms, would he have any thoughts or arrangements to take up shipping from trade?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my right friend makes a good point. There seems to be a visceral hatred of small business on the other side of the House, and a visceral belief that government should not be willing to contract with small business. I hear time and again government told we should contract with small business, we should work with small business, we should help small business develop. And yet when we actually do it, we get nothing but a wall of criticism from the other side. I say they hate business. This new Labour Party is very different to the one from 10 years ago. They simply hate business. But I say to my honourable friend that if we find ourselves in a no-deal situation, there are also other measures we can bring forward, and we're actively looking at how we would do that. Yeah.
Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, I have to say, I've never seen a minister bluster and bluff quite as much as this minister is today. Can he just say to me, everything he's heard today from the front bench and from the chair of the Transport Select Committee, does he not have one iota of concern about this contract being let to this shyster?
Mr. Speaker, that is an inappropriate thing for any member to say, and I'm not going to respond to it.
I simply say that the Secretary of State is perfectly entitled to his assessment of whether it's appropriate in political terms. Procedurally, no breach of order has taken place, but the Secretary of State made his own judgment, and I accept that. Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to hear the Secretary of State confirm that no money will change hands, but there are undoubtedly vast costs in terms of manpower and bureaucracy in no-deal planning. And we know that there are actual costs when it comes, for example, to commissioning refrigerated warehousing and special air freights. And all this could be avoided by the government ruling out no deal, which would be catastrophic, and no sensible government could and should inflict that on its people.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, the best way of securing no deal is to ensure that the deal passes through this House, and I will vote for it next week.
Angus Brendan McNeill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It feels daily that we're in the set of a film called Carry On Brexit. And given Le Figaro described it as sans bateau ferries, is what they've contracted to. The terms and conditions are from a pizza delivery company. We're wondering, will there be MV Hawaiian and MV pepperoni sailing the route? But the serious point, when we get away from the carry-on Brexit, is the Secretary of State is saying that if they don't deliver ferries, there'll be no payment. But if they don't deliver ferries, what will his fallback? What is his stopgap? What is his contingency? If there are no ferries, the whole thing falls apart. It is carry-on Brexit.
Well, an absolute tripe. If he clearly wasn't listening to me, 90% of these contracts have been awarded to substantial and established ferry operators, DFDS and Brittany Ferries. We did not have a reason to exclude a small business from taking a small part of the contract with a legitimate, valid bid.
Ray McKinley.
Speaker, it's remarkable, isn't it? If the government were to do no planning for all Brexit eventualities, they would be condemned. And now they are actually doing sensible planning. They now face derision. Now, I've met with Seabourn Freight. They have shown themselves to be the only interested party over a number of years in running new services between Ramsgate and Ostend, and that was even before this contingency planning. Personally, I welcome the dredging and improvements now taking shape at the Port of Ramsgate at no cost to local taxpayers. We will have a regeneration bonus no matter what, and I welcome that. Thanet District Council and the people of Ramsgate will do all they possibly can in Brexit provision, so I welcome the measures that you've taken, but there are people in this House who don't seem to be listening. Could my right honourable friend say once more that if they do not run the services that they suggest, there will be no cash for them.
I'm very happy to reiterate that. This is the responsible approach to a new contract with a new business that will pay when they deliver. But it's disappointing to hear the Labour Party so opposed to the regeneration of the port of Ramsgate. It is not so very long ago. It's not so very long ago that the Labour Party represented Ramsgate in Parliament. They do not deserve, given this negative attitude, ever to do so again.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the directors of Seabourn Freight has been named by the Financial Times as Brian Raincock, whose previous company went into liquidation in April 2017, owing £585,000 to its main creditor, HMRC, which is essentially the British taxpayer. Is he content that this excruciating fact apparently did not come up during his department's due diligence into Seabourn Freight before awarding the contract? And whether they do or do not deliver these ships, they have still been awarded a contract of £14 million. And I think it's right that members on all sides of this House have an issue with the Minister and his response today.
I keep telling her the £14 million isn't paid unless they deliver a service. I am not going to comment on the tax affairs of an individual, nor should she. What I'll simply say, Mr. Speaker, is the due diligence done into all those participating in the company found no reason why they're unfit individuals to do business with government.
James Dudridge.
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate the Secretary of State on his detailed preparations, but could he also consider how South Essex can support both with Tilbury, London Gateway, but also London Southend Airport that has experience of just-in-time delivery to Dagenham and is run by Stobart's Group, an excellent freight haulage firm.
Well, I absolutely agree, and of course, if we find ourselves in the no-deal scenario, a number of other ports, including Tilbury, will play a part in that. I hope we don't reach that point. I think we all agree that having a sensible free trade agreement with the European Union, a sensible agreement going past March the 29th, is what we want to see happen. But the reality is, Mr. Speaker, we need to make sure that we can prepare for all those eventualities, and in such a situation, many of our ports up the East Coast and along the South Coast will play an important part in making sure that trade flows freely.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very concerned about the legality of the procurement process which has taken place here. In his statement yesterday, the Secretary of State said that he had proceeded under Regulation 32 of the Public Contracts Regulations, which allows him to circumvent the normal, transparent and EU-mandated procedures. And I've got a copy of the contract notice here, which says that it's freely available on the internet, that says that the basis of proceeding under Regulation 32 is extreme urgency. Yeah. Now, as my honourable friend has already said, the idea that there was the possibility of a no deal, and indeed to quote the Prime Minister's words from last year, no deal was better than a bad deal, has been around for some time. So how can the government at this late stage justify proceeding under procurement that's only appropriate in the cases of extreme urgency? So I've got two questions for the Minister, and just for once, I think my constituents would like to hear an answer. Firstly, will he release the legal advice that permitted him to proceed under Regulation 32? And secondly, as he will be aware, if he has proceeded wrongly under Regulation 32, the Department and his government are open to legal action. How much money has been set aside for the contingency of court action about illegality of the procurement process and a claim for damages?
Mr. Speaker, let me say very simply, it is my view that as we move towards leaving the European Union, preparing for all eventualities is a matter of extreme urgency. That is also the advice my department has received and has given me.
Steve Baker.
Mr. Speaker, if members opposite had an ounce of sense and concern for the national interest, they would welcome the fact that this department is preparing to leave the European Union under all circumstances, and they would recognise the courage of the Secretary of State, his ministers and officials in actually testing and operationalising their plans. Does he share my disbelief at the policies which are being urged upon him by members opposite, and will he reassure me that he will continue his excellent work to prepare this country?
Well said. Very grateful to my honourable friend for his comments. I give him an absolute assurance I will continue that work. I think the tragedy, frankly, is that the party opposite seems to have abandoned interest in the national interest.
Tom Bray.
The train timetable fiasco, then drones disruption, the Manston Lorry Park carry-on, and now Ferrygate. The Secretary of State is the embodiment of the Peter Principle. Now, coming back to the earlier point made in relation to competition, can the Secretary of State explain the phrase extreme urgency brought about by events unforeseeable by the contracting authority? Can he explain to the House what is unforeseeable about no deal when this is something that the government have been planning for the last couple of years and have referred to many, many times in this place? What is unforeseeable about that?
What is unforeseeable, sadly, I'm afraid, is the attitude of very many members of this House, mostly opposite, towards the sensible agreement that the Prime Minister has brought forward, which meets all of their requirements, and they're now saying they oppose anyway.
Simon Clark.
The Secretary of State and I both represent Middlesbrough, which voted overwhelmingly to leave, so I found his comments attacking the Secretary of State for taking robust preparations for no deal very surprising. Will the Secretary of State commit that he will engage T-Sport in part of the preparations for any scenario that may arise out of Brexit preparations, because it's important that we make all the preparations required for all contingency?
Well, I'm very grateful, Mr Speaker, for that comment. I would reiterate that we are looking to involve other ports up and down the country as we make preparations for an eventuality that I hope won't happen. But the reality is the people of Middlesbrough voted clearly to leave. They will not understand, well, at least on that half of Middlesbrough, the reality is that their Member of Parliament is letting down the vote that they made in 2016.
Leslie.
Isn't the problem that if this contract fails, we will be in even greater problems in terms of the continuity of trade for our country? So it will be the public who pay the price, not just the potential contractor who lose their money. And just so we can get a bit of accountability from the Minister, he'll have seen on the front page of the Financial Times today the Department for Transport commissioned study that said just an extra 70 seconds of analysis, of discussion with each particular truck going across could lead to a 6-day queue for vehicles to get on a ferry. Has he seen that study? Is that study accurate, and will he publish it now?
Mr Speaker, we've been very clear in this House that if the French seek to impose maximum controls and put in place limited checks, it will cause queues. Why on earth does he think that we're putting in place some of these contingency measures? And he said, what happens if this contract doesn't go ahead? Well, as I said, 90% of this extra capacity is being provided by 2 established operators who will continue to deliver the service we're contracted.
Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Could I ask my right honourable friend to reassure the House that the Port of Dover and Eurotunnel are making detailed contingency plans in case of a no deal?
Absolutely give my old friend that assurance. We're working with both organisations and we're also in detailed discussions with the French. I have to say that both the French, the leadership in the north part of Calais and in Paris, and of the port and the tunnel on the French side, are as keen as we are to see fluidity continue through those ports. So we're taking contingency measures, but our prime focus is to make sure that trade flows freely, whatever checks are required.
Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Well, his colleague, the Home Secretary, has been trying to stop people getting across the Channel. He is busy contracting with companies that have no ferries at all. Is his next Wizzo move to contract people who are doing people smuggling in dinghies?
That's an absurd question which does not merit an answer either.
Damien Collins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. If there are delays in processing freight through the Channel Tunnel in my constituency or the Port of Dover, is the Secretary of State convinced that his contingency planning means we won't see a return to Operation Stack, that the M20 motorway will remain open in both directions if there are delays? And could he also give us an update as to when he expects his department to produce its site list for the potential long-term off-road lorry parking solution in Kent?
Well, Mr Speaker, it's my belief that Operation Brock will prevent a closure of the M20. That is the prime concern I have. What happened in 2015 should not be repeated. I think there is sufficient capacity to ensure that that will not take place. We have now completed the infrastructure works that are necessary on the motorways to ensure that the flow in both directions can continue. and we're now doing the detailed testing just to understand flows of traffic and how to manage flows to make sure that you don't see the kind of disruption you saw in 2015. And I'm hoping we'll move quickly. The consultations are happening now to be able to decide a permanent location and get the thing dealt with once and for all.
Graham Morris.
I think any members of the public watching this debate will be absolutely amazed. They'll think it's bizarre that we've got a Transport Secretary, a Secretary of State who signs a shipping contract with a shipping company with no ships. But given that they're going to hire in ferries, does the Secretary of State have any idea what plans the company have to crew their ferries and if UK crews would be used?
Excellent. I think, Mr. Speaker, there's a complete lack of understanding of business models on that side of the House. Honourable members on the other side should understand when they go on holiday next summer, there is a fair chance they'll be flying on an airline that owns no planes. Because the reality is, transport operators don't always own their own assets. They contract them in, they charter them in, and they operate the service. And I don't think they understand that. As to the crewing of the ships, that's a matter of the company itself.
Victoria Prentice.
Could the Secretary of State confirm to me that it is normal to award contracts in a small part to new operators, and that while perhaps 90% of operators used by the department are established, it is perfectly normal for the department, properly acting legally as part of its procurement process, to include new operators as part of the consideration?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. It is normal. We don't actually do enough of it. And government is frequently criticised for only contracting with big business and not actually contracting with small business. Ironically, now we're contracting with small business for a small part of the package we need. We're getting criticised for it. So you can't win either way.
Mr. David Anson.
Further to the earlier question from our honourable friend from Liverpool Wavertree, could the Secretary of State confirm that one of the directors of this company currently owes £580,000 to HMRC from a previous failed administration? Could he give what due diligence undertook on that contract? And secondly, could he tell us how we're going to repay that money to the Treasury?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to comment on individual tax affairs. All I'm going to say is that due diligence was carried out into the participants in this business and no reason was found why they should contract with government. Should not.
Marcus Fish.
It is very reassuring to hear about my right honourable friend's discussions with the Port of Dover and Calais and of the contingency plans that he's putting in place. Will he tell us a bit more about how companies can get to know what they have to do to make sure that their declarations are appropriately communicated to the port? Because that seems to me a potential pinch point that we need to look at.
Well, certainly one part of the no-deal preparations that we're now going through is, and HMRC are very actively engaged in this, is around the declaration processes the businesses would need to go through. Now, the reality is this happens already. Goods are shipped from this country, for example, to Switzerland. There are established processes in this country and on the continent. We will need to make sure in the run-up to a no-deal Brexit that business is up to speed with what it needs to do. A huge amount of work in this respect is already happening.
Sir Mark Hendrick.
Things are getting bad, Mr. Speaker, when the former Conservative Party chair accuses this government of using Dr. Strangelove tactics, and this is a perfect example. Instead of trying to prepare for a no-deal scenario, why doesn't the government just look at extending Article 50 so we can avoid this catastrophe?
Well, Mr. Speaker, two things. First of all, I think it would be wrong to block Brexit. And secondly, I think it's right the government prepares for all eventualities. It would be accused of being irresponsible if it did not do so.
Ellen Whately.
Mr. Speaker, the view from my constituency, which has both the M20 and the M2 running through it, is that we must not have another operation stack. So I welcome all contingency measures that my right honourable friend is making. But the reality is, whatever happens, the vast majority of our freight will have to continue to go through Dover, Calais, and so the flow of that route is absolutely critical. So will my right honourable friend advise how ready the French are to carry out any custom checks that may be required in the event of a no-deal Brexit?
Mr Speaker, we've had detailed discussions with the French. I am very optimistic that they have the same ambition that we do, and they're putting in place plans to ensure that happens. I have had personal commitments from the leadership in the north part of Calais, and of course there is a legal requirement, particularly in regard to the tunnel, for them to do so. The Treaty of Canterbury, Mr Speaker, requires them to keep trade flowing and traffic flowing smoothly through the tunnel, and I have every reason to believe the French will uphold that commitment.
Richard Burden.
In April 2018, Seabourn Freight issued in writing an investor briefing which claimed, and I quote, detailed port agreements with Ramsgate and Ostend negotiated and agreed. It is now clear that no such agreements exist to this day. Indeed, the Mayor of Ostend has given an interview in which he said, and I quote, a start-up in March is simply impossible. There is currently no agreement with Ramsgate and also with Ostend. So if the Secretary of State has satisfied himself that due diligence checks have been carried out that confirm the suitability of Seabourn Freight to receive a £13.8 million government contract, can he tell us what weight is attached to the fact that Seabourn Freight have issued inaccurate investor briefings? And can he also answer the question finally that my honourable friend, the chair of the Select Committee, asked him earlier, and name just one ship that due diligence checks have revealed that Seabourn Freight is likely to be able to bring into service by March of this year?
Speaker, I'm not, nor is it my responsibility to share the company's commercial information. What I would simply say is remind the honourable gentleman, no money will change hands unless they are running this service. That seems to me to be the best possible protection for the taxpayers' money.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Can my right honourable friend expand upon the discussions that he's had with the management team and what expertise and experience they are bringing to the table to operate this service?
Well, Mr Speaker, my officials have had detailed discussions with the management team, have gone through their plans in detail. As in detail, someone is quite interesting. My old friend may have seen the article in Lloyd's List, who've also been shown the business plan and have given it a thumbs up as being a viable option. Mr Speaker, this is a team of people who've got experience in this industry, who we believe will deliver this service, but of course they'll only be paid if they do so.
Stephen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. 95% of fresh produce in the Channel Islands gets there via Portsmouth International Port. Delays at our port would mean empty shelves in the Channel Islands in 48 hours. What guarantee can the Secretary of State make today to ensure uninterrupted delivery from all our ports of critical goods such as fresh food and medicine?
Well, Mr Speaker, incoming freight we intend not to put in place complex checks at the border. We've been very clear all along that the government's priority, apart from security, will be to ensure free movement of trade. Of course, goods arriving from the Channel Islands will not be subject to the kind of constraints you might see going into Calais. And the issues around transport blockages are really only ones that relate to the short straits around Dover and the tunnel, not to other ports where the movement of ships is not on a sufficient scale that it would cause significant blockages.
Matt Warman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It would be irresponsible not to prepare for no deal, of course, but wouldn't it be even more irresponsible to be spending money where we didn't need to?
Speaker, that's why we're not going to spend the money until the ships are available and running. But the reality is there is money we do need to spend to prepare for a no-deal Brexit. I hope that money proves not to be needed. I want us to have a sensible partnership for the future. But believe me, if we were here now, facing a no-deal Brexit and no preparation had been done, the shouting that we're coming from that party would be enormous.
Paul Sweeney.
Mr Speaker, the Secretary of State talks about supporting entrepreneurialism. Well, I'm a big fan of Dragon's Den, and I think it's one of those pitches that everybody would be cringing at had they actually seen it. But it seems to be good enough for the Secretary of State. He's talking about a no-deal Brexit. I think that the government should rule out a no-deal Brexit, but if he's insistent on planning ahead for it, he needs assured delivery of freight capacity on shipping routes. The Ministry of Defence has access, immediate access, to 4 roll-on, roll-off ferries. Why on earth hasn't the Secretary of State committed to using those assets that are immediately available to him instead of insisting on a highly risky contractual arrangement with a dubious private contractor?
Well, what I've done is insist on a highly substantial commercial arrangement with 2 very established cross-channel ferry operators and a small amount of business to a new operator. And what I say to him is that in the event that there is a no-deal Brexit, which I hope won't happen, we have a number of other measures that we can bring into place.
Rebecca Powell.
My right honourable friend give assurances that he's in consultation not just with Dover and Calais, but with other ports in the event of no deal, which I sincerely hope won't happen, and the way to avoid that, of course, is to vote for the deal. But in Taunton Deane, many businesses, lots of them small, rely on exporting, and they rely on ferries, and they must not be hampered, and we must act responsibly to give them assurances.
Well, the clearest assurance I can give, I mean, I've been to Calais, I've met my French counterpart to talk about this, I've met the president of the North part of Calais, officials have had discussions. I have had no sense from any of those conversations that the French want anything else but to keep fluid movement of trade through the Channel ports. That's something we should all aspire to.
Jonathan Edwards.
Does not this sorry episode clearly indicate that the absurd mantra of a managed no deal is a contradiction in terms?
Well, Mr Speaker, as I say, the government is not aspiring to a managed or an unmanaged no deal. We want to secure a deal, but it's not responsible not to prepare for all eventualities.
Mr Philip Oliver.
Commend the Secretary of State for recognising that it's absolutely in the national interest to make preparations for a no-deal Brexit, not least because it strengthens our negotiating hand even at this late stage. Can he tell the House what the Common Transit Convention is, not just for the benefit of the House, but in particular for the benefit of the front bench opposite, and how this will mitigate the worst effects of impeded traffic flows in the event of no deal?
Well, Mr Speaker, the Common Transit Convention is the international agreement by which trade flows across multiple countries. Now, in leaving the European Union, it has already been announced the United Kingdom will remain part of that convention, and that will play a significant part in ensuring that trade does flow freely in all situations. Nonetheless, we need to make sure we can't get blockages at key ports, and that's what we're working to do.
Wayne David.
In the interests of transparency, will the Secretary of State indicate to us whichever companies were considered for such contracts?
Well, Mr Speaker, we received 3 compliant contracts, 3 compliant bids, all of which we judged acceptable and all of which we accepted. 2 of them, major operators that will provide about 90% of the capacity, plus this small additional contract. There is also potential interest now, if we should choose to return to the market, in providing extra capacity. I hope we won't need that, because I hope we will have a proper deal come next week.
Douglas Chapman.
I see no ships short of weak, but what consideration is the Minister given to utilising ports in other parts of the country, namely the high exporting area country of Scotland? I'm hearing really good things about potential for a Rosyth-Zeebrugge ferry link, where potential ships have actually been identified. Is Scotland not losing out, and how can we realise the potential of Scotland in this Brexit fiasco?
Well, I appreciate that the party opposite, the SNP, doesn't support Brexit. And indeed we'd like to do everything we can to stop Brexit. But we will work to make sure that every part of the United Kingdom, including Scotland, is able to continue to trade freely around the world and gain from the benefits that will be achieved in this country in a post-Brexit world.
Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I see no ships, but I do smell something fishy, and I think other colleagues do as well. Is he really saying to this House that the best choice for this contract was a company that cut and paste its terms and conditions at the last minute from a fast food company? Is his new Brexit mantra a meal deal's better than no deal?
Well, of course, this is not a contract. It's multiple contracts, of which 90% are going to 2 of the biggest cross-channel operators, something the party opposite appears to be completely ignoring. The fact we've chosen to give a small proportion of this business to a legitimate bid from a small start-up business, I think, is something that government should do more often and not less.
Chris Stevens.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think our plea to the contractors is we want these ships, not excuses. And we've heard from the Secretary of State quite astonishingly in an answer to my honourable friend from Easington that there would be somehow driverless ferries. There will be no staff. So presumably there was no national minimum wage requirement in this contract. So can the Secretary of State firstly publish the legal advice he says he was given? That seems sensible given the concerns of the House. And secondly, can he tell us what were the requirements under procurement in relation to equipment, for example, ferries, or indeed looking at some of the social economic impacts of any procurement in relation to wages, for example?
Well, Mr Speaker, effectively what we're doing is buying tickets in advance on cross-channel ferries on a number of routes around the country. That's what we're doing. It's no more and no less than that.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's quite incredible that the Secretary of State has awarded a contract to a company with no ships, no investors, no customers, no credible business plan, no employees and no premises. Is the Secretary of State aware that Seabourn Freight tried to get an option to purchase the following 4 ships: the Hartmann Pushman, the Espresso Catania, the Espresso Ravenna and the Via Adriatico, which all operate in the southern Mediterranean and would need a complete refit to be able to operate in the Channel? In addition, 2 of these ships were found to be failed EU safety inspections. And on top of that, the Tirrenia who owned them said they wouldn't sell them because they didn't believe the company had the money. I went on their website and actually found that I could go on a Mediterranean cruise on these 4 vessels in April. Was the Secretary of State aware of that?
Secretary of State.
Mr Speaker, I'm not going to comment on the commercial plans of Seabourn Freight. What I would say is that I am satisfied that they will have the ships that are necessary to operate the service, but if they're not able to deliver them, they won't be paid.
Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Brittany Ferries has been awarded a no-deal ferry contract, but unlike Seabourn, they actually have ferries. No-deal sailings into the port of Mill Bay in Plymouth will increase our traffic by 50%. Could the Secretary of State point to where, on the 200 metres of tarmac between the ferry port and Plymouth city centre, he expects the lorry park, the customs checks, the veterinary checks and the environmental health facilities to be built, please?
Well, Mr. Speaker, 2 things. First of all, I thought it would be good for the Port of Plymouth to have more traffic. I'm sorry he doesn't agree. But the reality is also, Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, we do not intend to impose a hard border for traffic coming into the United Kingdom. We intend to focus on the fluidity of trade as our priority. Security first, fluidity second, but other matters come well afterwards. We are not imposing a hard border on this side of the Channel.